Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Living with XXY podcast series. I'm your host, Ryan Briganti. So today we have an incredible story by Russell Martin. What's going on, Russell?
Yeah, hey Ryan.
So Russell and I have talked previously. We've shared his story on our blog series. He's also done a previous podcast. And today's podcast is going to be all about his journey to fertility and kind of finding out his diagnosis. Now, Russell is Mosaic Klinefelter syndrome. And can you kind of explain what mosaic is?
Yeah, so the mosaic version of the Klinefelter syndrome is basically, the full Klinefelters, the non-mosaic, is when pretty much every cell in the person's body has the extra X chromosome. So they would have the XXY, 47 XXY. However, in mosaic, it doesn't happen like that. There's a portion of the cells that splits off that becomes, or either starts out as the regular XY, 46 XY, and then there's another section of that person's cells in their body somewhere that is the 47 XXY. So you kind of have two different sets of cells, kind of floating around. And that's really the best way to put it, just because from what I've read, it could be any percentage from, 1% to like 99%. So any of those in between, 0 and 100 is going to be considered mosaic. And it really varies. Even with someone who had, they say they both had 50%, the symptoms they have are going to vary pretty greatly.
And so leading into that, kind of like how you know so much about Mosaic Klinefelter syndrome since you have it, like how did you find out, like, and how old were you when you found out that you had this diagnosis?
Yeah. So when I found out, officially when I got the karyotype back, that was like later on in 2019. And so I was about 45, 45 years old then. And the story kind of didn't really start there. I mean, it sort of did. That was the official thing, but it goes way back into, when I was basically like 13 years old, like, just sort of starting out. When it was kind of first noticed by doctors. I was actually going out for a track team, sports team, and they have to do this sports physical where they look at the male testicles and everything. And that's when they notice something. They're like, okay, you're 13, you're just going through puberty, but still, this is, the sizing is a little off. So I started out going to an endocrinologist back then, and that was like late 80s, I guess, way back. So there was nothing on Klinefelter. There was no internet, anything like that. But there was a suspicion there. And when I went to the endocrinologist, they didn't do the full karyotype or anything. They just kind of, they looked it over. They kind of did some things. I think they may have done like a blood test, but it wasn't quite the same. And it never came back. They never said, oh yeah, you definitely have, Klinefelters or XXY. And really for me, at that age, I didn't, know anything about it. I just wanted to get like a doctor's note that said, yeah, you can go do track. So they gave me that, and that was pretty much it at the time. But looking now back, I could see there was definitely some other things I probably could have, been a concern, but really wasn't. It just kind of left, my mind, and just went on living life pretty much until I found out. And so I know we're talking more about the fertility. And so I did actually have back here SUNY ESF. That's the college I went to, where I met my wife. She would become my wife, and we ended up having kids naturally. And both of them are young men now in their mid early 20s. But it wasn't really, I kind of, maybe there was a little something back there. I was like, oh, people have fertility issues, and even not having Klinefelters, I knew that there could be problems either with myself or on her side. And so anybody who's going to be pregnant or thinking about that, you're probably kind of thinking a little bit about that, but it was never really brought up, and didn't really appear to be an issue with us, having kids. So when we had the two boys, we just kind of, again, went on living life until much later. Again, 2019 was when I was officially diagnosed.
So when it came to having kids, like, you kind of had that thought process, but did it take you guys a long time to have the two kids, or was it
Right.
something that happened pretty quickly?
Yeah, the first son, I mean, our first son, it seemed like maybe it could have been. I mean, I'm trying to think like how many months or anything. It was definitely less than a year, but when we like were officially kind of trying, so I would say maybe 6 months, something like that. But it wasn't anything that was like unusual, at least to us. And I know it for everybody. I'm sure it's different. Some people, it just happens, just one time, and and that's it. So it wasn't like that with us, but I think it was within the realm of a normal. And same thing for the second son. It was kind of just within the normal, I guess, time frame of trying to conceive. Trying to think back also, did we have any issues with the pregnancy or anything? And there was really nothing, again, out of the normal that I would think. Our second son, he was a little bit early. He was like 4 weeks early, and that was just because the doctors said, they looked at it and there was something with his kidneys. They just wanted to make sure everything was okay. But he was still considered a full term birth, and really, they were just like normal kids. Everything there was normal, so we had no reason to think that there was anything wrong with either my sperm production or anything like that. So I've never even had really a sperm test. Like, again, there was no reasons for it. But I sometimes I think about that. I'm like, well, if I had known, how would things be different? And I know at one point we did, even before we had kids, we talked about, if we can't have kids, like, would we be willing to adopt and things like that. So, and again, that I think was like a normal thought process for a young couple kind of trying to start a family. And but once we were able to, it just kind of, we didn't talk about it anymore.
So what, and I want everyone to know that Russell's story is like super. I think you're the only guy that I know out of the entire community, non-mosaic and mosaic, that has at least come forward to share their story and that has had kids biologically, like naturally, without medical intervention, like microtest surgery or anything like that, IVF or IUI. So like your story is so unique and so interesting, and it shows that there is the possibility that there can be a potential of having kids naturally. And having mosaic is probably what also increases that chance of being able to have kids naturally. And anyone else that's listening out there right now that would want to come forward and share their story, if you have had kids naturally or through donor sperm or however else you have, and you have XXY, please reach out, because these are impactful stories, just like what you're sharing today. So what kind of led up to you finding your diagnosis so much later in life when there was like that possibility at 13?
Right. Yeah. And it's really strange because there was really almost like, there's some statistics out there that like maybe 70-75% of people with Klinefelter's, syndrome, they never get diagnosed. And I definitely probably would have fallen into that category just because, again, I had kids naturally, didn't really have, I knew the testicles were, smaller, and I had that little blip kind of on the radar. But up till then, I didn't take testosterone or anything like that. And it was really more of the social aspect, I think, for me, that really got me going down the path. I mean, looking back at my college years, just looking at all the things, I had really great like friend relationships with other women, and just some of the things that I was really into weren't the typical like masculine type things. I really love doing like art. I'm an environmental scientist by trade, and just doing some of the things, I just felt more comfortable sometimes with these maybe more female feminine type topics, and I was looking into that, and there wasn't anything specific that really led me to that, but I just remember looking and googling things, and going to YouTube and everything, and the only thing that maybe came up was because of that, having the extra X, and some of the traits that some XXY had reported was some of those things, some more nurturing type characteristics, and some of those more social things. So that is kind of I guess, the little thread I pulled. And it was a small part of the big, piece. Of course, not everybody's the same. Not all XXYs are going to have those traits, but it definitely did for me. And I just kept going. And then I noticed some other things. The physical stuff really was about, just looking into it. I have scoliosis. Not everybody, again, will have that, but that's one of the things that is recognized with Klinefelter syndrome. And if you look at some of the other traits, I felt, really strongly that that's something I should pursue to look into. And, when I first did reach out to a doctor and geneticist, they were like, well, you have kids, so, you're probably not, they almost didn't even want me to do the karyotype. They're like, what's not really worth it, because you have kids, and like, they're so rare for anybody to find that. But I think, they did some blood tests, and they found some of the elevated, like, the hormones, the LH and the FSH and things like that. And that's when they started, okay, there's something going on here. And, just kind of went down that road until we did do the karyotype and find out.
So the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone would probably elevate like through the roof, elevated, and that was like
Right.
a trigger that your testicles are trying to make testosterone, but they're like
Hmm.
they're working so hard to produce the little testosterone that you had.
Right, yeah, and the testosterone was definitely lower. It wasn't super, super low, but it was on the lower end. And again, some of that I attribute to maybe being mosaic, that it was producing maybe barely enough to, sort of squeak by and things like that. And same thing with like puberty. I went through it. It was maybe a little delayed, but everything was like borderline. So it was like really hard to. It probably wouldn't have triggered anything for most people. So again, I would have slipped through those cracks pretty easily, if I hadn't really like pushed through and be like, I want to find out more. And so that's where I think a lot of men maybe that might have mosaic or maybe even a smaller mosaic percentage, maybe just kind of brush it off and it's like, it's just that's just the way I am. Go forward.
Yeah, like you said, like 75% die never knowing. And so there's a huge population of our community that like maybe things are popping up, maybe the small testicles, but like how often do men compare their testicles to other guys' testicles? And like,
Hmm.
just in general, like maybe the belly fat around the lower abdomen is like the typical dad bod, and that's based on like the food and all that stuff we eat in our culture these days. And so it's like, then do men traditionally go to the doctor and advocate for themselves and stick up for them and
Right.
kind of push themselves to go do and find answers for these things, especially when Klinefelter syndrome is the most common chromosome condition that happens to men, but nobody knows about it. So it's like,
Yeah.
how do we, if nobody knows about this, then you're most likely, especially you, like having kids and doctors just telling you like, no, you're not, you don't have this. And then
Right.
what ended up, you got that final karyotype, and how
Mhm.
did that, when you got those answers, how did that make you feel?
Yeah, it was definitely kind of an emotional thing, and I had kind of talked to my wife because it took a while to get to the karyotype. So, like a year before, almost, I had been doing research. I'd been looking into it. I'd been getting some of those studies done, and this was pre-pandemic. So, I remember because when the pandemic happened in whenever it was early 2020, like I was still had pretty new at finding out I had the Klinefelter syndrome, and like my first post, I guess talk with my doctor, it was all virtual, like here, because they weren't seeing anybody in their offices at that point. And even the doctor was like, "Wow, I wish we were in person." He's like, "Because I remember talking to you, back whatever it was, 6, 7 months earlier. That it was like, yeah, I probably won't see you again. We'll probably get a negative test, and that'll be it." So, but yeah, definitely finding out about that. I did talk to my family about it and kind of let them know, and they're all really curious, and they were all supportive though. They're like, "Wow, that's pretty amazing." Like nobody had really heard of it, and even going back to my parents, I was like, "You remember that when we went to the endocrinologist?" And they're like, "Yeah, that he was the guy." They remembered the doctor, and I originally was from upstate New York, is where I grew up, and they remembered going to this pretty big, I forget, it was like New York Medical Center or something up in Westchester, New York, and they said the doctor was almost like seemed disappointed when they were like, "Well, we got our doctor's note, so we're done. Like we're we just kind of said we don't need to investigate any further." And he was like, "Okay, well, I guess bye." But nobody really ever said, "Oh yeah, you definitely want to go down that road." So knowing that many years had gone by that it was missed was it was kind of dramatic. I was like, wow. And then, of course, knowing that my kids, how rare it was, that, I mean, anybody's kids are special, but knowing that something like that, how many things had to go just right for them to even exist is kind of still blows my mind that it's that small of a percentage. So,
So what was, you know the time, like the 45 year or the 30 years of your life, 32 years of your life that went by, and getting that diagnosis, like it took you a year to find out. So what were you doing over that year to,
right.
like, were you doing multiple tests, or was it just all research on your end?
Yeah, it was mostly research on my end. And I remember starting, really small. I was like, well, because I was really searching for anything that could be like, yeah, you could definitely have kids, and there's nothing. Like everything said that no, you're even if you have mosaic, you're probably not going to have kids. Like you said, there's maybe some anecdotal evidence of that. I remember reading in one paper that they said, there was, and it never really named anything. It was just like, oh, there was somebody who had kids and he had, it wasn't mosaic. He was like 100% XXY. And so they were like, that's like one person out of how many they studied. And same thing that you've said, I've, gone on to different, Facebook groups and in different communities. And I can think of maybe one where I remember hearing about somebody having kids, and it's hard to tease out whether or not they did some type of fertility drugs or something like that that may have helped, or if it was like 100% natural, which it doesn't matter. But for researching and for trying to like come up with a percentage, it's really tough to find that. So sometimes I'm almost like, wow, maybe like did somebody mess up? Like are they telling me I'm mosaic and I'm not or something? But I've gone and I kind of try to follow up, and especially with the hormones, because I don't take testosterone because my levels they're borderline low, but they're not like super super low, so I don't get as much of maybe some of those side effects of having really low T. Although as you get older, it goes lower, so that might change in me. But right now, yeah, I just kind of deal with it. I try to go to my doctor, and they know about it and everything. And I've had them check, and they've said, yeah, that's just how you were. And one thing that I do want to say is, props to you and to some of the other, the community out there, because really, I think now, especially, there's just more knowledge of Klinefelters and XXY. And I think maybe part of it is also the science of how people get diagnosed, like in utero and things. When I was, going through, obviously that wasn't a big thing back in the 80s, but I think now it's definitely more of a thing. So I see a lot more like either people are pregnant with the son or they already know it, and having those resources, it's incredible, that they can diagnose this now. And I think that's happening more. So that's a good thing, because again, there's some people that probably have gone on and passed away and had it, and they just never knew, and there was never anything to help them. They were probably just dealing with it, suffering in silence, kind of.
Yeah, non-invasive prenatal testing is, or the NIP test, NIPT. More and more families are getting it, whether you're over 35 because you're considered geriatric or high risk, or a lot of families are doing it for gender reveal stuff. And what we found is that the termination rate for Klinefelter syndrome was in 2006 was 70%. Because of they only did amnios back in the day if you were considered over high risk. And out of all those high risk families, 70% in the United States, 85% in Canada, and then like drastic numbers everywhere else in the I think it's like above the 90s everywhere else in the rest of the world. And hearing those numbers, and seeing guys like you and me and our everyone in our community, it's like, wait a second, what's going on here? Like, why, but then when you look back on before living with XXY, you look back when you were trying to find your diagnosis, you read the internet, you see all this negative, bad information saying you're going to be a criminal, you're going to be like all these horrible things, you're not going to be able to function or live on your own, and then now with the non-invasive prenatal testing, like the information isn't changing fast enough, and more families are finding out in utero. So we think that number is way above 70% now, because more families are finding out, and then the information on the internet isn't changing. But like guys like you sharing your story and putting yourself out there and not afraid of the stigma, or not afraid of speaking up about, okay, yeah, I've had my struggles, but then also you have your successes, and just sharing your, even though you're like maybe the only one that I know of and so far that has had biological kids naturally, like maybe that'll encourage other guys out there who have had it, who haven't thought as their story is that big of a deal, and they'll come forward and be like, hey, I want to share my story because I heard Russell sharing his.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's definitely like a hidden thing, just because again, people my age, they probably had the same thing. If maybe they didn't even go to endocrinologist, maybe like if I had never had that experience of trying out for the track team, I would have never even known, because like you said, I don't, I wouldn't have known that there was something wrong, or there's smaller testicles, or LH numbers, or any of that stuff. That was really on me to advocate, and that's what started it. Like I can imagine if I hadn't looked into those, the hormones first, and I just said, oh, you just test me like karyotype, they probably would have just shot it down and be like, no, we're not going to do that. So I really had to procedurally, get them to that point, even though I was already kind of, I felt that, I don't know if you can feel something like that, but I was like, when I started researching, I was like, there's too many coincidental like similarities between me and some of these other guys. So it's definitely, you really do have to be your own advocate. And like you said, for men, and especially, just in our day to day, everything else going on, I think men especially tend to just let that stuff fall by the wayside. And if you have a kid already, or you're married and you have other things going on, unfortunately that's part of it. So hopefully that will help, and people will read some of the stats and some of the good and bad things. I think it's good to know, but yeah, people just do one Google search and be like, oh, I don't, they just, it's like, I don't even want to know anymore. That's not me. I don't want to be that. And then they just close the book and you never hear about it.
Yeah, that happens. I think that happens a lot, as especially with small testicles or the belly fat around our waist, or possibly gynecomastia. And then some of the stigma online based around it, saying we're more female than male because we have an extra X chromosome and like all these things, but like we have a Y chromosome, we are men, like,
Right.
but what like gave you the power or the courage to advocate for yourself for a year of like constantly researching? And I know that we shared a lot of the details about this in your story on our website, but like I want to get into like why you advocated for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a weird thing. So I grew up in a large family. I guess I can talk about that story. And so I was so I have an older brother, and then there was me, and then I had three younger sisters. My older brother was like he's 4 years older than me. And then my younger sisters were closer. And I just remember hanging out with them, and I was always good at drawing, and so we would draw things and draw these little comic books together and stuff. And again, in high school, I remember specifically, doing these like I don't know, like study groups or whatever. And it seemed to be like me and a bunch of girls and females, and just being really, again, it wasn't like I was really trying to like, get all these girlfriends or anything. It was just like friends, just people I was hanging out with. They just happened to be female, and we got along great and everything. But I remember thinking about it. I was like, why am I the only guy in this group? And that's happened constantly, really, throughout my life, for all those 30 years. And I had always, thought about it, and there's little things like that. But I was like, it's just whatever. Maybe they're just comfortable with me or whatever. I don't know. But it definitely was in the back of my mind. And so when I started looking more into it, I do remember that experience back at 13. And I think even then I was kind of like, yeah, I don't want to know any more about that. It was because I do remember that the doctor or the endocrinologist, he had mentioned, and it was probably, he was talking about Klinefelters, but he mentioned, oh, some guys have lower, testosterone. That's what the smaller testicles are about. And I was super uncomfortable talking about that at that age. He was like, well, but if you get testosterone, you're going to get big, strong muscles and be this real big man and everything. And I was like, it didn't appeal to me at all. So I wasn't interested in going any further. But I think, again, just living life, going through things, seeing how I was, seeing how everything was, I really wanted to go down that route and find out. And I was glad to, I was happy to. It really was like almost, like a passion project, or I don't know, maybe I just was a little OCD on it, but I was like everything I could do. And even my wife, she's like, oh, you're studying about Klinefelters again. I mean, I was like taking a class. I would go on to YouTube. I would find this article. I signed up for that PubMed or whatever, these like scientific articles, anything I could get my hands on. I mean, again, I'm an environmental scientist. I've always looked at that, but it was almost like an experiment, to find out as much as I could. And then when I started just dialing it down, I was like, well, yeah, I mean, I gotta follow this through and see where, if it happened that I didn't have it, that's fine. But it would have been even more coincidental with everything I had gone through, that just very neatly, lined up with having it, that I was like, there's more of a chance that I have it than I don't.
And you created, I'll link in the link below, I'll link your story, and you created this like diagram of who you were. Out of all the research you did, you came up with like what the traits and what the things were that fit you, and you kind of described like mosaic, and you kind of figured out did you figure out how many cells you have versus?
Yeah, right. So they gave me, I don't know if they do it all the times, but yeah, for me, for mosaic, in the actual, scientific, the write up, I guess they gave it, or the diagnosis, it said the amount of cells they found that had the extra X versus the ones that didn't, and it came out to like roughly 6 or 7%. And that's based on, they call it the I think it's the white blood cells, I think. But either way, it's like a blood cell. And again, doing the research, they said a lot of that is super unreliable. Like those percentages could be way off, because like they could test the cells in your, pinky toe could be totally different than the cells in your hair versus your blood. I mean, it could be 80% in one of those in some organs. And so going through all that was like, yeah, it's hard to say, but yeah, that's officially what they found was, so for me at 7%, and that's 7% of extra X, so 7% XXY, and then the rest XY. So mostly, majority of the cells would be the XY, like the typical male cells. But even with that, I've got a lot of the symptoms. So, or not a lot, but some of them, enough to have actually use that to sort of help diagnose myself. So that's crazy to me that can happen. But I think it's also the other way around. Like if I had like 6%, maybe XY cells, and then the rest XXY, I don't know that it wouldn't, like the way that works, the percentages, it just doesn't seem to, it doesn't equal what your symptoms are. So it's tough.
Yeah, there's so little research on Klinefelter syndrome as it is, and then to actually research on mosaic added on to that, like there's even smaller research on mosaic, and then like trying to figure out these sequences of like what percentage of cells affects how much of the Klinefelter symptoms and signs you have. And then like I always try to tell everyone, like it's an autism saying, but it's like when you meet one person with Klinefelter syndrome, you meet one person with Klinefelter syndrome. Like, well, a lot of us have a lot of the similarities, but then we all kind of venture off on our own as well. Like some guys, their body does make testosterone. Some guys have sperm through like the medical intervention surgeries, like microtests, and they've had babies through like IVF, and then other guys can't. But then there's all these. But that's been the focus of this nonprofit and just spreading awareness is like, what are our similarities that we share like almost across the board, and what are the positives about this syndrome? Well, you say syndrome, right? Nobody likes that word, but what's the positives of XXY to where we can like get more guys to change their perspective on their diagnosis instead of like being like doom and gloom and this sucks and I'm not like I'm different than the rest of the world, and like seeing that and like through a bad scope and being like, wait, I'm different. Like I'm 1 out of 400 or 1 out of 650 or 1 out of 500. Like I'm the one there's 499 people like stuck in a cubicle, and I'm the one like on the outside of the windows, like looking in and being like, what's it like in there? But I'm so happy that I'm out here.
Yeah.
I mean,
a good way to put it.
It's incredible that you put in that much dedication and that much effort, to figuring out like, when you got your karyotype, did you know once you did that year of information, did you know that like almost 100% you had this?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I really felt it. Like once I started learning about it, I just remember it was like, I mean, I if I don't have this, like, what could it be? Like there's got to be something, because it just lined up so much. So yeah, just going through that, I was like, all right, I know that because I have kids, that's like the thing that's going to be like the big thing that they're going to be like, well, you can't, you don't have it. So I kind of knew going into that. And again, I, looked at the different hormones, and it is super unavailable, or just not, like doing the research of it. It's not user friendly is the best way to put it. Like it is not written for anybody but like serious researchers. So I really had to get with even just the vocabulary. I have like to go, and it's nice now because I can click on a word and kind of Google would say, oh, this is what this means. But there's so much of that with this that again, I can understand why people would turn somebody off in an instant, like unless you really had that desire to go, super deep down those rabbit holes. And even then you get to a point where there just isn't anything. It's just like, yeah, we got to do more research. And that was from like, 2006, and they still haven't done the research. So that's kind of, but I know there's more going on. And even with like your organization, or like with the Axis genetic.org organizations, I've kind of looked at some of their stuff. And so I know there's, they have, conferences and things like that. So I'm very interested to see, where the next phase of this information and research is going to go.
Yeah, it's trying to, I think that's you bring up a whole nother point that I'd love to talk to you about on the side, is like bridging the gap between the medical industry in our community. And we tried to contact a lot of the researchers and that wrote the old papers and say, hey, can we do a cliff notes? Can we rewrite this for our community? But there was a lot of pushback on, like, they don't want it rewritten to where people can actually understand it. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of research is done through accolades, through their own, trying to figure out things on their own. But then they say they want to help the community, they want to help, but then when they put out the research papers, it's like a foreign language to everyone that reads it unless you are a
Yeah.
researcher. So it's really hard to access that information and understand it. And then when you have
Mm-hmm.
already troubles with reading, writing, spelling, like articulation, comprehension, all of these things that kind of might come with Klinefelter syndrome, it makes that even more difficult for someone that's kind of trying to figure out more information about themselves or stuff like
Right.
that. I'm curious just about, like, once you got your diagnosis, and we talked about it a little bit, you talked a little bit about how, like, you told family, like, how, why are you open about your diagnosis? Why are you doing this podcast? Like, when you told family, were you worried about anyone having, like, negative views about it or treating you differently?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a big part of it, because there is so much unknown, and people would maybe just Google it and find out, some bad stuff. Like you said, there's the old studies from back that they said, there was like criminal things, and most of that stuff's been kind of debunked. But it's still out there for people who want to look at that. And I felt like, yeah, there's once I started reading more and getting more involved, I was like, yeah, you could sit back and just kind of be like, oh, I'm just, don't mind me, there's nothing to see here. But I really felt like getting out there, especially knowing, some of those, especially with the newer testing, the newer moms coming up or people like that. There's not a lot of examples of the guys that, have gone through it. And for me, that's like, it's heartbreaking to hear about. People are like, oh, I wish I would have known this. Some of those decisions you can't take back, so to have that out there, and it just to moving forward, to have maybe, some younger teenagers, and I know especially teenagers, you really don't want to be separated from the pack. Like you said, you don't want to be out of that cubicle. But in time, with maturity, and as you grow, maybe they will be like, okay, well, I remember this guy was talking about it, and so maybe in time it'll become something that's more talked about. And like you said, just like autism or some of these other things where it's not and it's not a disability in any way, but even just disability advocacy, that's becoming more of a thing. And just all these kind of barriers are falling to what used to be like, shh, you don't talk about that, or you don't say that. And so with the internet, with technology, it's way easier to do that. We're on opposite ends of the country right now, and so, like, back in the '80s, we had with a sketchy phone call or something, and we wouldn't have even seen each other. So this is probably the main things, is that the timing is now to kind of get this out. And so for me personally, I don't, I'm well established in what I'm doing. I don't, mature enough to know that anybody who's going to like make a decision like that isn't, they're not going to impact what I've done, my accomplishments, my family. And so it was important for my family to know, what I was going through and everything. And, I maybe, person on the street, I'm just not going to turn around and be like, hey, I have Klinefelter syndrome, something like that. But for people who are looking for that information, for people who want to know and have that open mind, I really would love to share with them and talk to them about it.
Yeah, you made a great point about like putting yourself out there, becoming an advocate for the community and letting people know that, like, you exist. And that's why I started living with XXY. Was I met people at a conference, and a lot of victim mentality of, I can't do this because I have this syndrome, or just the kind of not looking at it from the positive perspective. And so that was like, well, like, there's got to be more guys like me out there that view this not as a negative thing or a bad thing that's happened to them in their life.
Mhm.
And then that search and just being positive about it and putting yourself out there, just all of a sudden this community that was in the shadows just came out, and guys, and now more and more, I think the more guys that share their stories, the more guys that are listening on the back end in the shadows are, like, realizing that, like, there's so many guys that are just like them, and they're slowly starting to get the courage to come out of their shell, tell family, tell friends, like, not make it such a big deal. And I think at the end of the day, all of it has to do with acceptance. of just like,
Yeah.
regardless if you have XXY or you have diabetes or whatever you have, you're blind or you're hearing impaired, like it's just accepting yourself, like these are my cards, this is what I was dealt, I'm gonna either
Mhm.
like make the most of it and put myself out there and accept it, accept it. Obviously with Klinefelter syndrome, like information is slowly changing, and we wish that there was way more money in it, we wish that there was, but the more people that open up about it, the more money comes in, like more people donate to nonprofits, the more nonprofits can give back to their community. And so
Mhm.
it's like the stigma, the photos are slowly starting to change on Google because more guys like you are sharing their stories and putting themselves out there. And you're successful, and when you read about it, like just a couple of years ago, reading about like the most aggressive serial killers in the world, like had XXY, it's like you're
Mhm.
being pigeonholed into this box. And when you
Right.
looked at the photos online of like the guys in jail standing out with their arms out naked, and like, just because one person has micropenis in our community doesn't mean our entire community has micropenis. And so it's like
Mhm.
there's all these things, these images, and images I think are the biggest, the most impactful, is people being able to see the photos of you and your family, or talk to you in person, is what really makes a difference, because they realize like he's a human, like
Right.
there's a real person behind this diagnosis.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And and talking about that, I think inclusivity is also really important. I did have a woman recently, and she was a mom to a young boy that had XXY, and African American woman, and she was like, I didn't even know it was something African American people would get. She's like, I thought he was the only one, and then she probably saw the story or something like that, and she reached out to me, and I was like, yeah, no, it's definitely in different cultures. It's a random thing. It's not, and just because you're seeing it maybe more from one side um, doesn't mean it's not happening. And so again, and I've seen it, from other cultures, from and other people. Like you said, those percentages is maybe part of it. Maybe I hate to say it, back in the day, people probably would demonize anything that was different, and so they either didn't talk about it at all, or unfortunately, maybe the child just wasn't never came to be. So all those things though are changing, good and rightfully. And again, thanks to you and some of the other organizations out there. One of the things I saw that was really great, it was on your webpage, and I showed it to my mom because I was like, "Wow, this is amazing!" And it had like different, just words describing, typical things that like people with XXY, like nurturing, caring, these kind of things, artistic, good with your hands. And she was like, "Whoa, that's like 100% you." And she's like, if you show that to anybody, they're gonna be like, "Oh, this is great! Like these are great, traits." But you never see anything like that. That a lot of these things are similarities. So it's good to keep putting that out there. Yes, we're artistic. Yes, we're creative. Yes, maybe we're not the most macho, but it doesn't matter. There's so many other positive things, and there are some guys that are that way, and that's fine. But there's a lot that just there's a big span of all these things, and knowing, like you said, that people aren't on their own and that they're not the only one really helps.
Yeah, I think there's a big misconception about testosterone, and like how your doctor when you were 13 said, "Oh, you'll be this big macho man." Like it's like there's a lot of men in our community, like I think most of the men in our community, once they find out that their LH, luteinizing hormone, their follicle stimulating are like through the roof high, it's recommended to get on TRT. And obviously that's an
Mhm.
individual choice by everyone and where they're at, where their levels are at. But a lot of the guys that have gotten on T, they just say it's like cleared the fog out of their brain, and they feel like they can see like that they have more energy, that they're like just able to like hold themselves more accountable, and like but the fog is like the biggest one. And then a lot of guys will say like they had no libido or sex drive, and then they started on T, and then they all of a sudden had like sex drive, like they were 19 again.
Mhm.
And so, but there are guys in our community that push that bodybuilding, like they push that bodybuilding envelope. And when you read about Klinefelter syndrome online, you look see the photos, you see like the typical like low muscle tone, pear-shaped body, gynecomastia, like all the way to the stomach, tall, skinny, lanky, like long arms, all these things that you see. Like everyone that
Mhm.
reads those statistics under the Klinefelter syndrome like thing, whether it's on WebMD or like the NIH or any of the major like websites that pop up, that when you Google Klinefelter syndrome, none of it says that it's spectrum. none of it says that like it's not capable of, or that it's capable of getting muscles. Like there's a lot of guys in our community that are like bodybuilders now, and they're ripped and they've got muscles, and people are like looking at like, wait, I didn't think that that was possible. Like
Right.
even if they're not on TRT, there are guys that are like pushing the envelope. And so it's like there's this stigma of like what you read is what you get, and it's like the box around Klinefelter syndrome. And like for your case, like doctors telling you that there's no way you have this because you have kids.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I 100% agree. Yeah. There's just so many different ways to have it. That spectrum is really wide. And even with, again, having mosaic versus non, I mean, it almost doesn't matter in a way, just because like, like you said, there, even somebody with it, and there's, again, anecdotal evidence, but even somebody with the non-mosaic version, might have, they can be great bodybuilders. They can, they're going to grow facial hair or whatever, whereas somebody else might not, and that's just an individual thing. It's, the genetics of it is still be determined. I mean, that the research is still out on that, but suffice it to say, if you're living through it, you don't want to put yourself in a box where you don't need to be.
So is there anything to kind of like close this up? Is there anything that you would say to like the guys out there, or the newly diagnosed moms, like why you're sharing your story, or what you want to say to them listening?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely for the moms, I mean, having that support, knowing, any mom who's out there listening to this, you're already on the right path. I mean, you're doing the right thing, you're doing good. And I commend them for that. Anytime I get a chance, I'll go onto Instagram or Facebook or something, and I'll hear a mom saying, "Oh, I'm doing all this research." I'm always like, thank you. My mom didn't have as much resources, but she was supportive. They stood by me. Having that good family support is everything. I mean, that's good for anybody, but I think especially with Klinefelters, because you are, it's really easy to go down that slope of like, oh, this is, you can, like you said, victim mentality, or you can just start in your mind thinking, oh, I can't do these things. Where if you have that good support, community support, however you can get it, it's good to have that, and that really mentally will kind of break you free of some of the shackles of maybe you going down that gloom and doom, depression, and everything. And then, yeah, same thing. There's a lot of people out there that might not even know that they have it, and maybe they had a little inkling like I did, or who knows what it was. The wind blew something that day and just decided to go down that rabbit hole. Maybe they'll get this message and be like, yeah, maybe I should look into that. And don't just take the first answer you get and see something you don't like and be like, that's it. Keep going, pushing through it. It's usually worth it to find out what's actually going on for real.
I mean, that's incredible. And it's been amazing sharing your story, just a little bit about the fertility aspect, and knowing that like, even though you're that like 0.00001% of people in our community, like you haven't isolated yourself away from the community. Like you've come in and wanted to share your story and wanted to put yourself out there. And it takes a lot of courage for people in our community to just put themselves out there and share.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you. And we'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. Bye.